about verbs. Now, this is going to be a basic overview. I'm going to cover a lot of information. Like with some of the previous classes, I'm not expecting you to memorize all of this. That's why we have the class notes. What I am expecting is that you'll have an appreciation for the ways that you can begin to study and learn about verbs in a way that will make sense to you. So I'm going to talk about some of the tenses, some of the forms that verbs can take, some of the ways that in English we have some similar processes to Japanese in terms of how they change the tenses of certain verbs. And hopefully this will help to provide a base for understanding. So as you're going through your verbs and you're memorizing, your taberu and your nomu, you'll have some idea of how you can begin to conjugate and use those verbs. Towards the end, we're also going to touch very briefly on particles. This is so that you can begin using them to build actual sentences. So that as you develop your vocabulary, as you gain more kanji, as you acquire more words, not only can you conjugate the verbs, you can actually begin to use them in sentences. You can ask people for help. You can describe how your day is going. As we get deeper into these various topics, I'm going to focus in on the specifics. This is more sort of, I want you to be able to see the different directions that you can walk in so that you can start to make those first tentative steps. So to start off with, I'm going to repost a chart that has been posted a couple of times by this point. Let's grab this real quick. And we're going to talk a little bit about the two major classifications for verbs. Now, as you can see here, you insert a verb, you take a look at what ending it has, and then from there, you decide how you're going to conjugate it for some of the major patterns. Let's talk a little bit about what those actually mean. So we'll start on the right-hand side. These are our changer verbs, but the more proper term for them is godan. The U ending on the verb can be changed to a different vowel when it's conjugated. So, for instance, the verb kiku, which is its dictionary form, can become kikeru when conjugated. So the U sound becomes an E sound. The U becomes an E. For the most part, the conjugation for these godan verbs is pretty simple. You change the vowels, you add an ending. The only time that it gets complicated is the past tense plain affirmative. The past tense plain affirmative, not only do you need to modify the vowel sound depending upon the ending, sometimes things can get a little bit complicated. There are 5 different patterns depending on the ending, which you can see in that extension of the chart. I want you to focus in as you're learning your various conjugations. Focus in on that bottom chart, because when we get on into some of the more nuanced conjugations, knowing that chart is going to help you a lot. Because a lot of those conjugations utilize the same vowel transitions. For example, the te form of the verb is literally, and the te form is a Swiss Army term, which we'll get into all the fun stuff later. But the te form, to pick a random example, is that for, but you change the A to an E. Now, how do you identify a godan verb? Well, they're basically every ending that isn't iru and eru. And also some of the ones that are iru and eru. Does this make the other type of verbs a little bit complicated? Yes. Apparently, there are some methods of telling apart true ichidan verbs from the ones that just happen to look like it but are actually godan. But all of the examples that I've seen so far have led me to believe that you just kind of have to memorize them, which is a little unfortunate. But what is fortunate is that the ichidan conjugation is super simple. Because the ichidan conjugation for these dropper verbs is you drop the root and then you add the ending. That's it. All there is to it. Which is really nice and really convenient. Lastly, we have our irregulars. As I mentioned in the first class, most of your irregularity in a language is going to come from your most frequently used words. So we have the verb to do, to come, to make the obvious bottom left joke. You see where I'm going with this. Really, there are only two that you need to worry about. The verb to do and the verb to come. Yes, suru and kuru. There is a little bit of irregularity that you need to be mindful of in the verb to be, but that is true of virtually every language. So, I briefly mentioned something called the dictionary form. The dictionary form, or the root form, is how you would look it up if you were to go to a dictionary. Now, it's also used as the plain affirmative present or non-past. The other one that you're going to want to know is the stem form before we start getting into how you can actually conjugate some of these damn things. So, wait, no. This is why I need to proofread these notes more. So the dictionary form is not the same as the plain affirmative non-past. Scratch that. Oh, you're fine. We only just started off. Really, all we talked about so far is how to tell apart the two main families of verbs, which is basically everything except iru and eru is godan, and some of the iru and eru is also godan. And the chart in the bottom right, which breaks down some of the godan verbs based on how you would conjugate the plain affirmative past. When you're learning the godan for some of the more complicated conjugations you can do with them, you will want to know that chart. All right, so to backpedal, to clarify, and also to make sure that you're on the same page, you've provided me with a convenient excuse to fix my previous mistake, so I do appreciate that. So the dictionary form is going to be your taberu, miseru. It's the form that you use when you look it up in a dictionary. Now, why is it that you might want to know The dictionary form? I don't know. It might be because if you know the dictionary form, you can plug it into a website like this and generate literally every single conjugation for the verb. So when you learn verbs in vocabulary books, when you learn them in Wanikani, you will frequently just be taught the dictionary form and then be expected to do the conjugation yourself. So you might be given the dictionary form and then be told, okay, here's the dictionary form, and this is a go-done or an ichi-done verb. Okay, let's move on to the next word. So understanding the process of conjugation will make things a lot simpler for you because you will need to learn less information and still be able to do all of the fun stuff with verbs. These are different pronunciations. Can you point out where the different pronunciations are? Oh, well, the pronunciation is going to be the same. Tabe is always tabe. Masen is always masen. So conjugation is basically the process of taking a verb stem or verb form and then converting it so that it has a different relation to time. In this case, a different sense of politeness or plainness, or formality versus informality. In English, we use not to invert a verb to make it a negative. In Japanese, it is a distinct verb form. So your verb negation is part of the verb itself. Yeah. So, for instance, I fly, he is flying. Now, in English, we changed the ending of the verb. I'm going to touch on that in just a second. We changed the ending of the verb based on who is doing the action. In Japanese, you don't do that. You don't have to worry about conjugating the verb based on how many things you're talking about, which is great. The side effect of that is that you must imply or state if you need to draw the distinction. So if in the context of the sentence, you and the person you're talking about know that when you say airplane, you mean collectively all the airplanes that you've been talking about, you don't need to specify. But if it's a conversation where you've been discussing various airplanes, maybe you've been talking about flight in general, you might need to specify the group of airplanes that you're talking about, but you don't need to worry about changing the verb. I mean, if you want to talk about conjugation, Chiara was talking earlier about learning Latin. There are 6 different conjugations for each individual tense, because you have I singular, I plural, or we, you singular, you plural, he, she, it, and they. Each of those is a different ending. So the fact that Japanese has a really nice and convenient chart where you don't have to worry about conjugating based off of how many of a thing you're working with. I will happily accept the conjugation into the polite form, because the conjugation into the polite form is super simple. In fact, that is actually the next topic to talk about. Yeah. So on the chart itself, it goes through the conjugation for taberu. So taberu's plain affirmative present is taberu. There's no change from the dictionary form. If you wanted to say is not eating, you would drop the ru, because it's a dropper verb, and you would do tabenai. When it comes to the polite form, one of the really nice and convenient things about the polite form is that it's easy to conjugate in both the godan and ichidan forms. Because, dropper verbs, ichidan, you drop it, you add the ending, you're done. On the godan side of things, the polite form is often referred to as the I form, because to do all of the conjugation into the polite form, you change the u sound at the end into an I. So no mi, no mu becomes no mi, and then you add the ending. And that's all of the polite forms in godan. So if you are fine with just sounding polite, possibly to the point of seeming robotic to some people, you can start with the I form and then learn how to be casual later on. Now, is this going to help you if you want to get into some of the fancier conjugations later? No. So you will want to learn the casual versions of it. You will want to know some of the vowel switching so you can do some of the cool stuff down the line. But learning the I form, learning how to be polite with the godan verbs is a convenient starting place. Fortunately, the I form for the godan verbs is also its stem. So the stem form, which I was about to poke at, you take your dictionary form and you drop the root. Now you have your verb stem. For some conjugations, it is easier to work with the stem form. For some of the fun and fancy stuff. For the godan verbs, the stem is you swap the u sound at the end with an I. So with godan verbs, the stem is the same as the I form. So nomu becomes nomi. Let's talk a little bit about the different reasons and the different ways that you can conjugate. So let's grab this chart that I threw together, which is in my notes. So the reason that I've chosen to group this like this, as opposed to the way that it is on the chart, is because you can see there's some clear patterns in terms of how things are arranged. So your plain affirmative non-past, you use your root form. The ending that you're going to use for your non-past negative is na. Affirmative past is ta. And when you combine those things, when you're talking about the negative past, you're going to put the negative identifier first, then the past. So it's not directly naita, it's nakata. But it is people aren't computers. Are they even in this call? If I was just posting that for grammar, I would be a very bad teacher. I'm going to continue on with the lesson because we have a lot of ground to cover in terms of things that I want to convey, so that I can open up the floor to question time. If you look at the conjugation for the polite form, similar story. Pretty much all of them start with mas, so masu, masen, mashida, masendeshita. And you can see the same sort of pattern. You imply that it's negative first, and then you imply that it's past in terms of how the final conjugation or the verb ending is formed. So we have nai and ta becomes nakata. Masen, mashita becomes masendeshita. So that's sort of the way that those words evolved. So why is it that they have plain and polite forms? Well, part of it's cultural, and part of it's for convenience within the language. You have to, in a sense, understand the culture within which the language was born, because that had a very strong effect in terms of how the language was used, and what they wanted to make convenient. So, for instance, in Latin, you have all of these different tenses and conjugations and specifiers for groups, because Latin was, in some ways, a language where you wanted to be very precise. You know, if you were talking with someone, you weren't mincing words with them. A lot of the Latin that we have to this day is this very, you've been saying, is that on purpose? No, that's because my brain is undercaffeinated and I'm still waking up a little bit, because I'm in a fugue state. Because I stayed up to watch the 3D, and then I was watching some of the super chat reading, and so I'm currently like trying to get my brain cells to fire up. But yes, so it should be nakata. Back onto the topic of plain versus polite. So one of the things that you're going to have to learn by implication, by your relationship with someone, sort of the way that you are able to speak with them. I mean, you don't go into work, slap your boss on the back and say, "Hey buddy, how was your weekend?" You might say, "Hey, you have a good weekend?" Or you might address them by their name, or you might address them by their last name, depending on what kind of company you work for. If you're in the military, you have a different, set of language skills that you use in the military setting. If you're watching over kids at a playground, if you're babysitting, you will respond to that child differently than you would their parent. Like you might say, "Get down from those monkey bars." But if it's your friend horsing around on the monkey bars and you're just a little bit concerned about them, you might say, hey, maybe you shouldn't do that. So it's not a wholly alien concept. It's just that for the sake of convenience, because of the way that the culture was as the language was being developed, it became codified in the language itself. Because it became important to be able to um, concretely convey that information. Now, I've made this next joke previously. Oh yeah, Old English was slathered in honorific terminology that was almost caked on in places. I've made this joke previously, but in terms of other conjugation, you have no actual future in Japanese. You have your present tense, or your not past tense, I should say, and then you have your past tense. Like in English, you have to create the future. You can do this with a couple of different methods. You can use helper words. Example would be go versus that helps to convey a sense. You can use words related to time. Say, at 9 o'clock, I'm busy. So you are using word something. Lastly, there are specific grammar terms. I'm going to veer a little bit into some of the stuff that falls outside the scope, but that I want you to be aware of, so that if you have the drive to dig deeper into it, or we can dig deeper into it during class, you at the very least know what it is that you're looking for. So there's three main ways to imply. Shouldn't have. Ask someone to drink, you might say, I should have prepared this word in advance because I forget the conjugation for knowing. But you would use the um, the equivalent would be something like, won't you drink? Or let's drink. You're acknowledging that it isn't currently happening. Won't you drink? potentially be able to start fumbling around with the language on your own. Um, but it also means that it will be easier to explain things in their appropriate contexts. Yeah, imagining it as a question mark is a pretty apt way of looking at it. Lastly, we have our positive and negative, which is basically is, was, will be done versus isn't, wasn't, will not be done. So having covered those basic conjugations, I was giving an example of how the negative tense isn't necessarily um, just the case of he didn't do the thing. You can also use it with the ka particle in the negative non-past to say something like, you're not drinking. But the implication is more sort of, let's drink or won't you drink? Um, so with these basic conjugations, you can begin to start to actually use some of the verbs that you're using, that you're learning in your vocab sessions. Now, whether you've already started vocab, whether that's still a distant dream for you, um, that's perfectly fine. This chart will hopefully help you to, or these two charts, I should say, should hopefully help you to begin conjugating and using some of these verbs. Before I move on to some of the fun other conjugations, which I'm not going to tell you how to conjugate them yet, because they're complicated and interesting, and they have a lot of fun uses. Are there any questions on these sort of basic conjugations? No, we good? Alrighty. So, other types of conjugations. We have our te form, which I see someone typing, so I'll let them ask their question. Fair enough. So the te form is frequently combined with other words for various purposes. So, for instance, if you were making a request of someone, if you were asking for them to perform an action, um, you would use the te form followed by kudasai. You're basically saying, please do thing, kindly do thing for me. Yep. Now, there are tons of different uses for the te form, which is why I'm calling it the Swiss Army form, because it has a lot of different pieces of utility. The te form, for instance, can be used to link different parts of the sentence. So it's a somewhat complicated topic in and of itself that I think I will probably spend a lesson on by itself, just going over the different uses for the te form. Um, hmm. Yeah, it's very much similar to that. Next up, we have our imperative and command forms. Now, the imperative form is, I have the authority to tell you to do something, but I'm going to politely ask that you do the thing. But we both know that you have to do the thing. The command form is, do thing. Do it now. I am not asking, I am telling. Well, that's part of why I'm trying to link them to some fun mnemonics for people. The imperative and the command form are both things that you probably will not use in casual situations, in polite situations. Um, if you're a manager, you will still probably use "te kudasai." Um, but if someone is being an idiot, you might use the imperative. The command form is like if you're in the streets and there's a fire and the police need you to move down the block, they might use the command form because you need to move. Go away, make room for the fire truck. Oh yeah, if you want to if you want to use the imperative with random people, basically you will seem like you're throwing your weight around. Like everyone that you say that to, you are basically implying I am in a position where I can have you do something for me. Um, and I'm telling you go do the thing. I'm not, phrasing it as a demand, but you have to bear in mind the implications of the imperative form for the situations you intend to use it, because it is much stronger than making a request. There's the ba form, which is related to if X action, then Y result. So if ba form verb, if this action takes place, then Y. Now, some of that is going to be from implication based on the topic. Ba as well is a little bit on the complicated side because of how it can be utilized. So we will probably end up spending some additional time on that because it can be quite useful. We have our volitional form. Shall we or let's? The volitional form is let's go and do the thing. Let's go on the roller coaster. Come on. Um, the other word that I've heard used for it is the invitation form. It's basically proposing a possible course of action. We have the potential and causative forms. So the potential form is can do or able to do, and the causative form is caused or allowed to do. So the potential form would be um, we know that he can't be the killer because he couldn't have been at the club. Or I know that you'll take good care of the restaurant because you can cook very well. Whereas the causative form is more um, you know, someone someone with the ability to incite or cause an action to not take place, caused or allowed it to occur. So you might say something like, "The boss allowed me to take a vacation." Um, Finally, we have our passive form and our causative passive. The causative passive is the only one that I was able to find that combines two other forms together, but it's pretty self explanatory. Because the passive form is to be blanked. Um, so, for instance, the sandwich was eaten, the beverage was drunk. The causative passive is caused to be blanked. or allowed to be blanked. So, for instance, you want to set up a tent at a campground, and the person tells you no, and you ask really nicely, and then they allowed the tent to be set up. Now, the reason that I'm not going into all of these conjugations is because some of them use the te form, some of them have their own specific rules in relation to the verb stem. It's a lot of information to dump on you all at once. But I want to begin explaining some of these other conjugations as well, because let's say that we're having a conversation about the class, and you want to say something in Japanese. You want to show off your skills, or you want to practice a verb that you've learned. If you only know that these 8 basic conjugations exist, you might end up fumbling around for what's the word for if, what's the word for if, and not realize that there's a specific verb conjugation where you don't have to worry about finding a word for if, it's in the verb. You might want to ask someone to do something for you. And it might say, okay, well, if you want someone to do a thing, here's how you say do thing. And it might give you the imperative or the command form. And you might seem like a jackass. But if you're at the very least aware that these other conjugations exist, that a lot of the particles that we take for granted in English, because we use them all the time. We use if so much. We use then all the time. In Japanese, a lot of those particles are bundled in with the verb itself, with the verb's conjugation. One thing that I do want to note about the passive form in Japanese, which I am still wrapping my head around, it is possible to use a passive voice in Japanese where in English the sentence would not make any sense. I have yet to encounter a need to do anything like that. I just know that it's a thing that is possible. I'm sure at some point I will find a situation where I want to use passive voice, where in English it would be impossible, but in Japanese it's fairly common. When I find that situation, I will let you guys know so that I can share that knowledge. So those should, in theory, be all of the other conjugations that are worthwhile to know, because they're all the ones that I could find. So, any questions on the other conjugations? Hopefully not something too in-depth, given the fact that we are trying to focus in on the more basic uses for the verb. But I'll kind of open the door to whatever, and if I don't know the answer, we can look it up. Is there a comprehensive list of the irregular verb stuff? Yes. So in terms of verb irregularities, I had this nice little list earlier. Here we go. So this should cover most of it. So there are a few kasuru and kuru are highly irregular, but then you have a little bit of irregularity in some specific corner cases. So at the very least, this should help to get you started. What else? All right. If there's no further questions on verbs specifically, oh, I saw you typing. Fair enough. So let's talk a little bit about particles, and then we can go ahead and jump back to opening the door to miscellaneous questions. Now, the most common particle that I've seen talked about here is wa. Now, it uses the character for ha, but when used as a subject marker, it's pronounced as ha. Sorry, as wa. Has my caffeine really not kicked in yet? This lesson is so scuffed. I'm glad that I'm doing this twice. Oh dear. Basically, what you're doing when you use the wa particle is talking about the topic that you want to discuss. So remember what I said about needing to imply things, needing to set the right frame for the conversation. Well, this particle is how you do that. It's not a subject marker the way that we think about the subject in English, because it is not necessarily the thing that is doing the action. It is the topic that you want to discuss which provides a frame of reference for the conversation. So oftentimes it is a thing that can be omitted if the context is known. One way of thinking about the use of wa is to think like regarding blank. So, watashi wa alkayas desu. Well, regarding myself, I'm alkayas. Now, if we know the context, if you've just asked me for my name, I can drop the watashi wa. We already know the context. In the exact same way in English, if someone says, "Hey, what's your name?" Oh, I'm Alkaias. I don't need to set the frame. We already know what the frame is. Next, continuing the story tradition of particles that are written one way and pronounced another way. Is there a reason? Yes. And it relates to the reason why the kanji characters are kanji instead of hanji. At the time that the Han Chinese characters were being conveyed over to Japan along with Buddhism, they didn't really have a ha sound. But they did have a ka sound. So instead of hanji, which would complete the pattern between countries like um, like Korea, um, it's kanji. They just use the different sound for it. My understanding, and this could be wrong, but my understanding is that the character that they used for wa as the particle became ha because of how they set up the hiragana chart, and because of the readings. But because it was used colloquially as the topic marker, it just stayed that way. And so when they said all of these kanji are now written like this, as it evolved over time, um, people could just kept saying it as wa when using it as a topic marker. For other words that it was involved in, it became ha over time, but the topic marker just stayed the topic marker because it was used so frequently and would have been so difficult to change um, that people just didn't bother. Now, again, that could be wrong. Um, but that is the understanding that I've obtained from reading through history and studying how the language developed over time. Uh, yeah, basically, when it comes to language, similar to the suru and kuru verbs, your irregularities will come in your most frequently used elements of the language because everyone uses them. And because everyone uses them, people know what you mean when you say it. So if there's some funkiness in the language, as things get standardized, it still stays in sort of that colloquial, well, everyone knows what I mean. It's too late to change it now kind of form. It's why the verb to be in English is such a pain. Yeah, exactly. In just about every language, to be is the worst verb because it is the verb that everyone uses all of the time. Even now, I'm saying is and be have nothing to do with each other. You just have to know those conjugations in English, despite the fact that it is nightmarish. It would sound odd if you said watashi ha. People would probably understand what you meant uh, because you said watashi, mispronounced something, and then gave a name. So they'd probably be able to comprehend your speech. It's just that you might get some looks. Um, let's do the object and then the question marker and leave it at that because particles are its own separate thing. Um, and we will be here for another 2 hours. Not necessarily because it's complicated, but because there's just a lot to get through. Well, on the Minecraft streams, when they're talking to each other, they'll often say out loud what it is that they're typing, which is kind of adorable in a way. In some ways, I have to wonder if it's for the benefit of their audience. In other ways, I have to wonder if it's they're sounding out the words because they have to think about it as they're typing them out. And my opinion on that matter changes depending upon who it is that I'm watching. Okay. So, on the subject of particles that are said differently from the way that they are written, here is our object marker. Now, normally, you would pronounce this character as wo, but when you're using it as an object marker, you'll say o. So, um, this is the object of the sentence. This is the thing being acted upon. So, I drink my caffeinated chocolate shake, which is really nice, by the way. Um, I am acting upon an object. Can I use that in a sentence? Sure, okay. Um, well, I have this lovely bar of dark chocolate here. So, watashi wa choko o tabemasu. I eat chocolate. Now, again, because I'm using context that is known, I don't need the watashi wa because we know what the topic is. We know the frame that we're having the discussion within. So you could just do something like onigiri wo taberu. Well, so here's the question that I'm going to ask in response to that. What do you mean by ending particle? Do you mean the end of the word? Okay. So you pair your wa particle written as ha with the term that you are referencing as the topic. Ka ends a sentence because ka transforms the sentence into a question. Mhm. So when it comes to particles outside of those three, so we have our ka particle at the end. It transforms the entire sentence into a question. So to give you an example from an incredibly cheesy scene from the most recent Star Wars movie, they fly now. They fly now. One is a question. One is a statement. One is making an inquiry as to the situation, asking for an explanation. The other is a statement of fact. They fly now. So the ka particle, um, I would have to run through a lot of examples to sort of hammer out the ways in which it can be used to turn things into questions. But the core idea is you're asking for an explanation, you're asking for clarity, you're asking if something is the case. So it's very useful. Oftentimes, it will be paired with a question word, which will specify the type of question being asked. I think one of the most common ones that you might be familiar with is nani. But there's a whole slew of them. Yes, to clarify, wo after the object, but it's pronounced as o. So you drop the W sound. So like hua, we run into the unfortunate situation of saying it one way and writing it another. Yes. We have nani, we have doko, we have nande. Um, really? Because I've run into the opposite situation of seeing it very frequently paired with the cockpit. So I was under the impression that it was a requirement. Then again, my focus was on. um, let's see if I can find. No, this is the wrong list. Okay, so the reason that you've seen nanika previously is that ka and mo can combine with question words to form new words. So, for instance, nani and ka becomes someone, dare and ka becomes somewhere, doro and ka. Oh, sorry. Nani ka is something, dare ka is someone, doko ka is somewhere. So that's the reason why you've seen nani ka previously. Yes, scrolling keyboard ASMR. I actually have a really clickety-clack keyboard, but unfortunately, my main PC rig is currently at the store because it's one of those ones where it needs like paired RAM cards. Otherwise, it starts to lag, and one of them died a little while back, and I took it out thinking everything would be fine, not realizing that without its pair, the other RAM card either wasn't working or was actively slowing my computer down. So it's getting a tune up at the moment. But when I get that back, I have a very clickety clack keyboard. Probably too loud, come to think of it. Okay, that was an incredibly loud video, YouTube. Uh, okay, instead of searching for the particle, I'm instead going to search for a question word, and I'm going to see how it is used. Okay, so um, the ka particle isn't necessarily always used for all questions all the time, always. Some examples: nan no nomimono ga hoshi, which means what kind of drink do you want? In this case, the nan is being modified by the no. We're getting into corner cases and edge cases very rapidly with this, apparently. So I'm going to make asking questions its own separate unit, specifically because we have stepped on the landmine that is linguistic nuance, which I was hoping to avoid today, so that we could cover everything in a timely manner. So to give a bit of a rough recap, we talked about the two main families of verbs, the godan and ichidan. We talked about how we conjugate those verbs by dropping endings or changing the vowels at the end, then applying an ending to them. We talked about the pain, the absolute delight that is the godan plain affirmative past. And all of the fun mystery that lies there. We talked a little bit about dictionary and stem form for use in looking things up. How polite should you be in general? If you are casual with someone all the time, always, I want you to think of someone who is basically impolite, like overly casual. Like there are some people. There have been some very casual statements made previously, and I think Ma compared some of them to talking like a yakuza. Which isn't to say that you can't just be casual with someone if you want to. But you have to be mindful of the frame of the conversation and your relationship to them. Is this person your really close friend? Is this person a colleague or coworker? Is this someone who would feel comfortable if you were casual with them? It's frequently better to be polite and respectful rather than informal and casual, unless you know that the person will let you be casual with them. Is there a thing as being too polite? Yes. You can be polite to the point of belittling someone. If you are overly formal, overly polite, that's a somewhat extreme example, but that's honestly kind of on point. Yeah, if you are overly polite with people, as just been said, I kind of just I'm just going to say Megamin. I don't want to just say Megamin Janai every single time. But as Megamin has just said, if you speak in an overly polite way with someone, they might think you're being cold or distant. There are also te-form requests that you can make that are so polite that you're basically mocking someone. Like if you're in a situation where a casual request would work fine and you elevate it to the highest form of respect, it comes across as sarcastic. It's sort of like if you're sitting in a bar with some friends and your friend starts talking about something, you could be like, "Hey, let's not talk about that right now." If you were being overly polite and overly formal about it, you might say, "I kindly request that we not discuss this matter further." It's like, wait, what? I mean, there's a lot of additional ornamentation in that one, but yeah, hoops did. Uh, that gets me every single time I see it. Um, but yeah, so you want to be mindful of your relationship with the person in terms of what it is that you can get away with saying. Fortunately, because Japanese does have these sort of indicators in the language, it's really easy to tell how someone else is reading the situation based on the language that they're using. If they're using polite speech, they're thinking this is a situation where they should or perhaps must use polite speech. If someone is using um, informal speech, they feel comfortable doing so. Maybe they don't care about your feelings, or maybe they think that the relationship is close enough that they can switch to that kind of language. Uh, what else in this meandering recap? Um, yeah, so we talked about politeness versus plainness. We talked about the past versus not past, and how you need to create the future, which is a very motivational and inspiring thing. Um, you have your positives and negatives, um, where the positive and negative don't necessarily just mean something is or isn't done, um, but can also be combined with other words for things like won't you drink. And then we have a whole mess of additional conjugations that we'll touch on later, but are important to at the very least be aware that they exist and the reason that they exist, which is to say that they help clean up sentences by bundling up some of those extra particles into the verbs themselves. Lastly, we touched on particles. We have our topic markers, we have object markers, we have question markers. I guess one way of looking at it based on what it is that I'm gleaning from the chat and reading online, because my main focus was verbs this week, but I did a little bit of digging into particles in preparation for this so that we can actually start using the language. It seems to be the case that ka can be used to turn a sentence that would not normally be a question into a question, um, but can also be paired with question words. Whereas if you use a question with if you use a question word within a sentence, it is also de facto a question. But there does seem to be some nuance there. So if you have questions and you want to ask them in Japanese, it is probably also a good idea to ask a question about your question to make sure that you formed it the right way. Oh boy. Does it not use tone to turn sentences into another meaning? Yes, with exceptions. um, to properly cover that topic is another class as well. Um, because we have to worry about the pitch accenting. We have to worry about the proper ways of setting up your pronunciations. So we'll get to that. Um, I will add that to my list of topics to cover in the future. The goal today is basically to do this introduction to verbs and particles so that the people who are starting to get into vocab have a framework to begin playing around with the language, so that they can start, writing Japanese in the Japanese Learning Channel. Because I think that would be neat. But also because, like, once we have our next class, which will be just on particles, so I will need to do some digging into the whole questions topic so that I can use ka correctly and explain that to everyone next week. After that, we have a vocab session. And the vocab session is going to be bring me a topic. Bring me something you want to be able to discuss with someone. Now, that could be you want to learn how to flirt with girls so that when you go to Japan, you can walk into a bar and you can be this, sophisticated foreigner who knows how to speak competently and praise the beauty of a woman's eyes. Or maybe you want to learn how to talk about science and engineering. Maybe you have an aspiration to one day work in Japan for a company, and you want to learn some basic technical terms. Yeah, or you want to ask about, buying and selling goods at the inconvenience store. So vocab day is everyone's going to bring a topic. Everyone who doesn't gets to sit on their hands and listen while we going through it live. We will find words related to that topic, and we will look at ways to find other words. I have a great big book, which I'm actually going to grab real quick because I need to highlight an example. Now, I've made this comparison previously. Because in English, you can run a mile, but you can also run your mouth, but you can also run a bath. These are the technical term is kind of collocation. These are word combinations that people understand because they're used frequently. Even though you may not necessarily know why your bath or your fridge might run or might need to be run. After all, you might run the dogs, or you might run the washing machine. You can see where I'm going with this. So I have a great big book of 3,200 Japanese collocations. Word pairings, whether they make sense or not. Will you need to know every single one of these? Probably not. Are they useful to learn if you want to speak like a native? Yes. So on vocab days, I will be referencing this book so that when we want to convey certain phrases, when we want to discuss certain topics, we will also have some collocations We will also have some human sounding speech, so that we can talk like people who actually use people who actually use the language on a regular basis, um, which I think would be the ideal circumstance. The only thing that's potentially worrisome is the way that they've decided to organize some of the words in these topics, because some of them are listed in what is basically character order. That is to say, organized based on their spelling on the hiragana chart, and some of them don't seem to conform to that rule. Yeah, we're basically done with what we had planned today. We're now in tangent and clarification territory. When you see them written, is it always when those two here are next to each other that they make that sound, or is it a closeness? It's actually a size thing. So let's say, for the sake of example, that I want to write kia. Let's switch to my Japanese keyboard real quick. So first I have kia, then I have kiya. Yep. The fonts, unfortunately, can be a little bit screwy at times. Fortunately, most of the time when you have these paired characters, it's usually pretty obvious which is the small version and which is the big version, because they will inflate or emphasize the character when it's by itself and shrink down the character when it's being paired to help contrast it. Also, like that. So, kite versus kitsute. I mean, the same question could be asked of things like now. The part of the reason for it is just that you're changing um, the initial consonant sound somewhat. Um, you're converting a ki into kya. Um, so as for why it's not, that word always, I know what it means, and I know it's supposed to be a serious term, but I can't get over the fact that when I was studying Latin, the teacher I was learning under would always make a joke about it. Oh, it would vary from class to class. It would also depend on what word he was using as an example. I think he chose his examples specifically to make jokes about diphthong. Anyway, so why isn't it its own combo? That is an excellent question, but it's usually unnecessary. Whereas it's necessary to denote when you're using kia versus kya. Like if you see nai, then it's going to be nai. Bill, 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 Bill. Yeah, so I think in some ways when it comes to questions like that, it really boils down to a question of utility. How do you remember and tell them apart quickly? Um, so the only real one that you need to worry about when it comes to that is the Dakuten versus Han Dakuten for the H column or H row, depending upon your chart. Because you do need to keep in mind that you have ha, you have pa, and you have ba. All of the remainder of them are relatively straightforward. Obviously, there is a little bit of rote memorization that goes into it. Unfortunately, there's no getting around that in some cases, but for the most part, they make a kind of sense. Were there any in particular that you were struggling with? Mm. Okay. Well, you're basically never going to have to worry about using Z. It, I have I have yet to see, even in the study of archaic terminology, that term actually come up. Um, but the differences between chi and sa, I do completely understand. because they are mirrored with each other. The way that I learned it was to look at sa and ki. So, yeah, there are some that are just extremely rare. And Yoru's got it. Those are the Dakuten. And then the Han Dakuten is pop quiz for you, Yoru, while I explain this a little bit. Um, so I learned Sa and Ki because they both face in the same direction. And they both gave me trouble because one's one line and one's two lines. And because it was convenient to learn it that way, I learned Ki Sa Ne. Ki Sa Ne, which is a character from Naruto, who's a shark man. Because the meh character was also giving me some trouble because it looks a heck of a lot like the nu character. So I needed to have something to distinguish meh and nu. Two birds, one stone. Because I was doing all of this repetition on ki and sa, which face the same way, when I would see chi, I would go, this is the weird one. This is the one that doesn't conform to the pattern I have made in my head, and so therefore this must be chi. So I created a rule so that there would be an exception to that rule. It was completely arbitrary, the rule that I made up. But I made up a rule that made sense in my head so that I could then apply it to the chart and make it easier for me to work out where my exceptions were. What was the other one? Oh, wa, re, and ne. Like there are differences in terms of what that tail do. Some of it does come down to repetition and practice, but the fastest way, in my opinion, to at the very least begin to use it, is to come up with your own rules. I think it was Yavaru who said that mnemonic devices can be a problem. And I'm in agreement that if you lean too heavily on your mnemonic devices, they become a crutch. So it's important to study to the point where you no longer need to rely on the mnemonic, where your brain kind of short circuits around it and goes directly for the information you're looking for. All right, that's a pretty great mnemonic. I'm not gonna lie. Mm. When it comes to making something second nature, um, the key thing that I can tell you is think speed. So in the beginning, you use the mnemonic, you work out what the term is. You work out this means this sound or this means this word. You take however long you need until you have it right. Once you're comfortably going, oh, I see this, I know what it means. This is this shape, which means this mnemonic, which means this sound, and this meaning, boom. Then you give yourself a time limit. And say, I'm going to go through these words, and if I don't get a right answer in 5 seconds, bump me to the next question. Both. The answer is yes. That's part of why we're doing a vocab session before we do katakana. There's a lot of different pieces of the language that mesh more easily when you know parts of other elements of the language. Does it? Introduction to language, hiragana follow-up, basic sentence structure, vocab session, katakana follow-up, asking and answering questions, vocab session, kanji basics. Oh. I'm of the opinion, based on how it is that I've been studying and based on what it is that I've seen from a lot of other people, you can't go wrong unless you focus only on one specific area. If you focus in on just vocab, or if you focus in on just kanji, or if you focus in on just writing practice, you lose out on the ability to make connections across different parts of the language. And those connections will help to reinforce your learnings and make it easier to learn more stuff down the line. You'll forget katakana many times before you finally learn it. I found that out yesterday because I was like, oh, it's been a while since I've had to rigorously test my katakana knowledge because there are some that come up really frequently, but some that barely come up at all. Let's see how many of these I've forgotten. And I went onto Kanabento and I loaded up the thing and I sat there staring at the screen for the last 10 going, I have no idea what these mean. It depends on how frequently the person that you're talking to uses loanwords. And that really varies depending upon context. Katakana is also sometimes used as kind of a bold facing for certain hiragana words. It's infrequent, but it does happen sometimes. So it can sometimes be used for emphasis. So how frequently used is it? It really depends on the context. You might not see it for weeks, or you might use it in your daily life. Also, depending upon how it is that you're studying, the furigana for the onyomi and kunyomi readings for a kanji might be written differently. So one might use hiragana and one might use katakana specifically to highlight the fact that one reading is the onyomi and one is the kunyomi. So yeah, in the discussion of what to learn first and why, I found a series online that is someone plays a video game in Japanese, and every single line, every single time there is dialogue, it plays the line of dialogue, and then it plays it again slower with the sentence spelled out on screen and a translation color coded, highlighting this part of the sentence is this part of the English sentence. This over here is this bit. And some of the kanji that I have been learning were in those sentences. And some of the vocab that I've been learning were in those sentences. But sometimes the kanji was used in vocab that I didn't know yet. But I could sort of grasp at some of the meaning because I knew some of the kanji. I don't know what the onomatopoeia is for click clack on the keyboard. I kind of want to learn this now. I wonder if there's an onomatopoeia guide. Kata kata. Well, that wasn't nearly as exciting as I was hoping it was going to be. Yep, now we know. Alrighty, so I need to work out how many people actually weren't able to make it to lesson who were delayed. I just pulled up Kiara's stream, and she is very big for some reason. And now she's small again. Oh no, not wide Kiara, just big. Like Titans on the wall. Anywho, I have some laundry that I need to take care of. Yes, Fuafua is a very necessary kanji. A very necessary onomatopoeia. Fuafua is perhaps the most important. Except no substitutes. Look, we would be here for days. Any wordless suggestions? It's perfectly fine to keep asking questions. Any wordless suggestions? Well, I have this secret list. Because I took a light novel and I copied all of the text over into a Word document. And then I used an Excel spreadsheet to count the occurrences of each individual character. And so now I have this document that says that in this light novel, the character for I occurs 9,682 times. It's a hiragana. I know that one. We move on. Na occurs 6,900 times. It's a hiragana. I know that one. And on down the line. And the first kanji character that occurs 1,364 times in the book. There are 30 other characters, almost all of them hiragana, that occur more frequently than that. And the next kanji doesn't pop up for another 40 characters. It occurs 800 something times. So, in terms of occurrences in literature, at least, obviously there are some words that show up more frequently than others because there are some kanji characters that occur if we go all the way to the bottom, there's some kanji that are only used once in the entire book. So out of 204,182 total characters, some of these only come up once. So I am going to need a dictionary with me when I start properly translating this. Yes, it's perfectly okay to ask it. But while looking up some of these kanji in preparation for this translation project, I realized that a lot of the very common kanji that I was looking at were on the N5 test list. And some of the most frequently used characters were on the N4 list. So I would recommend looking up JLPT N5 vocab. There's a bunch of different versions of those lists. But that's a good place to get started. Painfully honest moment, a lot of language classes will tell you just learn the JLPT N5 vocab and you'll be fine. I don't necessarily think that that's the case. I think there are a lot of words that are on N4 that are important to learn early on. Unfortunately, I don't yet know enough to be able to point to which words those are. I don't yet know enough context about some of the characters to be able to point to specific N4 words and say, it will be difficult, but it will be worth it at this stage in your learning. But the N5 vocab is pretty easy. The kanji characters are relatively straightforward. They do come up pretty darn frequently in terms of conversation. In a lot of ways, similar to how learning the characters is the first step to learning the language, which is the difficult hump that sends a lot of people running. The N5 vocab is that first burst of information where once you have that, you can begin to make sense. Maybe not necessarily of the specific translations of certain terms and their utility, but you can begin to know, oh, this is a question sentence. This is a request that someone is making. Have you enjoyed our group study sessions now that we've been doing them for a month? Well, this is lesson 3 technically, but we have been doing this for roughly a month because we have done some setup time previously. I've got to say, every single time I see someone say something like, I blitzed through katakana in a week, I'm going to start working on kanji now, I feel really impressed and really proud. And when I see someone go, well, I'm behind, but I'll sit in anyway, I'm impressed and proud. Because to see people, seeking to improve a skill, to acquire mastery over something is inspiring. And especially something like this, where for a lot of people, language can be very, very difficult. I mean, all of the stuff that we've been talking about right now, I have, over the course of these lessons, repeatedly stepped on landmines by bringing something up that was outside the scope of what I initially wanted to talk about, and then misspeaking about it, and then needing to be corrected on it. But I've enjoyed that process because it means that I'm improving. And that helps me to be a better teacher when I'm conveying that information the next time around. So I've enjoyed it quite a bit. The word for fox is when you find level 60. Literally the last thing you learn on that platform, although it's a commonish word, it's really hard to put them in order. Yeah, it's difficult to organize the words in a program like Wanikani because of the way that they chose to structure it. Uh, which is, unfortunate in its own way. Um, if you want something that's kind of a cheat sheet, I don't know for certain how accurate this list is, but this might be helpful. Are there some particularly difficult kanji that are used very frequently? Yeah. So if you use this as your jumping in point, you might encounter a wall. I would not necessarily recommend starting with this list, but once you get into learning kanji, once you begin to build up your process, this might be a good point of reference. In the last few meme review streams, even though I only know a few words in Japanese, I found myself, in a lot of times, understanding what the girls were talking Japanese through osmosis or something, I guess. My question is, if that's normal when learning a different language, is it a bad thing because it might make the brain lazy, or it might just be a case of me getting cocky and I should be aware of it? I mean, if you're understanding things that are being spoken, if you're catching the gist of it, that's good. That's a positive thing. Don't for a moment think that it's a bad thing to hear someone speaking and be able to derive a meaning from it. Now, do you want to 100% trust that interpretation? Not necessarily. If it's words that you're confident about and you're basically filling in the rest with context clues, that's fine. Um, if it's words that you're kind of shaky on, then don't 100% trust the meaning that you're deriving from it, but celebrate the fact that you at least kind of got what was going on. That's a very positive indicator in terms of your language progression, because it means that you're understanding this is a word and that is a word, and here's where the dividing lines are. Uh, Onyomi is used when you use it with a kanji, and kunyomi is not for that. Uh, that is the general rule. There are some exceptions. Unfortunately, the exceptions are kind of hit or miss. Uh, you will typically use the onyomi or kunyomi. But for instance, there are some kanji where there's only one reading, so you don't have to worry about that. There's some kanji where there's multiple versions of an onyomi or kunyomi reading. And so you'll basically have to know your vocab. Which ties back to what we were talking about earlier, which is that if you know your kanji, learning your vocab will be easier, because you'll look at it and you go, okay, I know what the possible readings for this are. And if you know your vocab, when you go to learn your kanji, you go, I've seen this before. I know that in this context, in this word, this kanji is read like this. And the meaning of the word was this, so this kanji probably has a meaning that relates to that somehow. In the same way that I found this example online, and I find it really, really helpful um, in terms of explaining some of this, because we have some very wild examples where the kanji's direct meaning isn't necessarily employed, but sometimes there are cases where the word for beauty salon can be made using the characters that basically mean beautiful looks institution, whereas a barber shop can be composed using the characters for hair arrangement shop.
All right. I need to speak for this. So how, for example, for Onyomi, it's two kanji characters beside each other, right? That's the Onyomi pronunciation.
So when you say two next to each other, I'm guessing you mean something along the lines of sensei, for instance.
Yes. Or that one.
Mm.
Fire Mountain. Volcano.
Hey, we see Fire Mountain again.
Fire Mountain.
I turned my volume up, and I was not expecting how loud you were going to be.
I'm sorry.
Fire Mountain.
Well, let's grab that one real quick. So the kanji for mountain, the onyomi is san.
Sun.
We're going to use the dakuten for san, so zan.
Sun.
But by itself, we use yama.
Yama.
To be mountain. So we say Fuji-san. We don't say Fuji-yama. Although that would be kind of fun and funny.
Yama.
And in the same way, the onyomi for the character meaning fire is ka, and the kunyomi is hi, or ho, like Hokage. Yeah, I have an opportunity to talk about Kazan now. I went and I rewatched the Hollow Graffiti episode with Ayame and the bucket full of lava, and I completely forgot that she. Have a good one, Airwolf. Thank you for stopping by. I completely forgot. Yeah, I completely forgot when she's having the conversation with Miko, and she's like, "You know what a volcano is, right?" I'm like, "I know that word." So it's a pretty adorable episode. But yeah, so in the case of Kazan, you are using the onyomi readings. But there are some examples where you're combining terms together. So you have Hokage, Fire Shadow, in Naruto, which is using kunyomi. Mm-hmm. So we have our general rules, but then we also have plenty of exceptions to the rules. So start with the rule, but don't rely on it too heavily. Kanji isn't necessarily super intimidating. It's just complicated. And when I say complicated, I don't mean difficult. I just mean there's a lot of it. But as you learn each of the moving parts that goes into building a kanji, recognizing a kanji, the more you learn of those little pieces, the easier learning the rest of it becomes. Which is part of why I continue, despite the fact that you have to pay money for going beyond level 3 on it. I recommend Wanikani, even if you just do the first 3 levels. Because the initial focus in Wanikani is you're learning radicals. You're learning the building blocks, the shapes that go into making a particular kanji. So let's take one of the ones that I've unlocked recently. So let's go here. So there's a kanji meaning previous or past, which has 3 different radicals that comprise its shape. So let's switch back to my Japanese keyboard real quick. Now, that might look like a great big blob. Compared to some of the other kanji, it's relatively straightforward, but if you're just looking at it as itself, it's just a collection of lines. But if you know your radicals, you can identify the 3 distinct shapes for those radicals, and it helps you to tell this character apart from others that are visually similar to it. Slide, dirt, and legs, according to Wanikani. Do I have a Japanese keyboard or just use a normal one? I just use, personally, I just use the Japanese keyboard that comes with Windows. I press Alt-Shift on my keyboard to switch to it. And then I press Alt-tilde to switch between regular English characters. And it's basically predictive text. Like if I write ka, it's going to give me the hiragana character by itself. But if I keep writing, it's going to make a recommendation based on what it is that I've written in terms of, do you mean this character? Do you mean these kanji? Which is pretty helpful. But yeah, so kanji looks really difficult and really tricky at the outset. Oh, we do this twice a week. So no, it's perfectly fine. We're in question time. We do this twice a week. We do it 11 a.m. EST and on Sundays, and we do it 7 p.m. EST on Wednesdays. But if you start by breaking down kanji into its individual components, if you start looking at some of its internal rules, it's relatively straightforward in terms of an individual rule. It's just that there's a lot of little things that you have to learn. But that accumulation of knowledge comes with time. Yeah, I mean, it looks hard to see the parts because you're unfamiliar with what it is that you're looking at. Like when you started off, if I threw a whole bunch of hiragana at the screen, you wouldn't even know where to start. Now if I throw some hiragana on the screen, you might have a sense of, okay, well, here's these characters, and they make these sounds. As you learn the radicals and as you learn more kanji, frequently you will see instances where kanji characters are used like radicals, where one side of a kanji is a different character that you've learned previously, and the other half is a radical or some other character. So as you learn more about the bits and pieces, it will get easier to recognize their appearance in the more complicated shapes, which in turn will make remembering them a lot easier. Unfortunately, that one's just practice. Sad to say. Alternatively, increase your font size. Like for the Japanese classes, I have specifically increased the font size on my Discord program, just so that I can tell what some of the characters I'm not familiar with are. Does it mean that I can read or translate them? No. But maybe I'll recognize them if they come up multiple times over the course of the session. And then at the end, I can look up, the complicated kanji and know what secret joke is being passed around in the back of the class. That is the sun. I mean, obviously, it's a bit more nuanced than that, but that is a mean one. Well, the reason that Megumin's thing is mean is because if it was flipped, if it was the other way around, it would be Nihon, which is Japan.
Sun.
But if you have it the other way around, I know it's still Hon, but is it? It's not Honichi, it's Hon. It's either Honjutsu or Honjitsu. But I can't remember which. But I'm pretty sure it means today. But then you also have Kyo, which means the day, because, why have things make sense, right? So there's also this, which is Kyo, which,
Today.
as far as I'm aware, doesn't actually use the readings of those kanji. It just is its own thing. But it uses the character for now and sun, as in, the sun right now, today. In the same way that you have Kongetsu, which actually uses the reading for that first character and the character for moon. And so if you have a lunar character, you are counting the months. So now moon is now month this month. It's both. Part of the reason that there's two different readings for the characters is that you have some readings that are typically, again, rules and their exceptions, but typically used if the character is by itself. And then you have readings that are for if it's paired with other characters. So the answer is both. One noteworthy example that I can give. Let's see. So we have Joshi, which uses the character for woman and child. The characters by themselves would be onna and ko. And in fact, there is another word, onna no ko, which also means girl, in the same way that we have different implications in the way that we refer to teens and preteens and children based on the specific pronoun that we're using. Onoko. I'm having a bit of a brain fart moment because I know that, for instance, otoko. I need to look this up.
Otoko no ko.
But yeah, so as you can pretty plainly see, kanji is a deep well of confusion and exceptions and little rules. But fortunately, they're all rules. So you can learn a thing. Doesn't this have a different meaning in the internet? Probably. It is, after all, the internet. And just about anything can be a slang term.
Ah.
Actually, based on the context, no, I'm not going to Google otoko no ko because I'm terrified about what it is that I might turn up. Yeah, I have some laundry that I need to do. I've been talking for almost 2.5 hours. And unlike Tencho, I don't have a lot of practice with speaking for extended periods of time. I will have to work on that. So some backstory there. My dad studied German for about 6 years, just because he thought it was a cool language. Can I speak some German? Like the barest snippets of German that my dad would speak from time to time when he was making a point about something. Also, he was really into the comedian Eddie Izzard. And Eddie Izzard is multilingual. He speaks Spanish, French, Italian, German. I haven't caught any of his work in ages. Really funny person. I think last I heard he was getting into politics or something. All right. See ya. Have a good one. But yeah, so can I speak some German? Kind of. Vaguely. Also, I had some friends who learned some German back when I was in high school. Because the entire theater club decided that they wanted to learn German, I guess, as a meme. So there would be, sessions at the theater club where they would just speak in German. Yeah, it was definitely a weird flex. No, but I got dragged to a lot of theater stuff. Like as much as people like make jokes about theater or music kids, um, like the band students who get really bored one day and disassemble instruments so they can wear them like wizard hats. A lot of them are really cool and creative people, which is why they got into music in the first place. So if you have the opportunity to make friends with someone who's into theater, I recommend it because at the very least it won't be boring. They might be overly dramatic, but it won't be boring. So your German name every beer. Anywho. So that about wraps us up for today. I will make a couple of tweaks to my notes to reflect some of the additional information. Oh no, like I said, I didn't do theater. I was one of the people who sat in the back and just did homework while everyone else was painting the set, and occasionally let them know, hey, this thing's about to fall over, maybe, put some bracing here. I was more one of like the woodworking shop class kids, like building robots, doing programming, that kind of thing. Like I learned people skills through osmosis. Because I'd sit in the back and I'd read my manga, and all of the theater kids would just sort of drag me along to have me there, which was nice. It was a nice environment to just sit and chill and read, and occasionally make passing conversation about a musical that was the flavor of the 5 months. It's like, As good of a musical as Rent is to some people, it will forever be ruined for me, just solely based on the fact that the songs were sung at me so many times. Yeah, I'll see if I can find some better verb charts for people to use. I mean, the tangents were interwoven with a lot of good information. So yeah, we didn't run into any topics that were absolutely horrifying. I think the worst one was the mention of otoko no ko, which apparently has something to do with a specific subset of a certain culture. So yeah, keep the tangents in. Speaking of bottom left stuff, so I'm gonna say this in the actual proper announcement for the vocab session. I'm perfectly fine with us discussing certain types of terms, as long as it's done in a respectful fashion. Like, we can make all the bottom left jokes that we want, as long as it's keeping to the server rules. But when it comes to a proper discussion of certain terms, whether it's anatomy, whether it's actions, I am fine, and I'm going to check with the mods to make sure that they're fine with it before I shoot myself in the foot. But I'm fine with us learning how to use the language in the context of learning the language with seriousness. If people make a bunch of sex jokes, if they make a bunch of poop jokes, we're going to have to put a hard stop on it. Yeah, for vocab class in 2 weeks. So if people aren't showing the topic the respect that it needs, then we're just not going to be able to do that. The alternative is we create a new role and put all of the stuff that's sensitive behind a wall somewhere so that only people who we can trust to take those topics seriously have access to it. I think that's a really stupid plan. So I hope that I don't need to do something like that, and that when we cover these topics, we can treat them with some dignity. Again, because it's language. Either you're going to learn some slang by picking up a vocab book of slang and learning to use it the wrong way, or you're going to learn it the right way, so that at the very least, when you choose to use those words, you are speaking coherently. I wonder if this Conjugation book has anything like that in there. Probably not. Scratch that. It has things on body and hygiene, and it has a section on romance. So this book on collocations does actually have parties, hobbies, and other interests. Yeah, so this book of collocations does have some terms that are related to some of that. I would like to be able to talk about some of those things so that when you encounter those words, you understand what it is that's going on. And so that, as you strive towards language mastery, if that's the thing you want to do, you're equipped with the language for it. Like, if you want to go to Japan specifically to pick up chicks, that's entirely on you. But in the context of learning the language, that is detached from the intention behind the use of the language. Oh, the first thing that most people learn when they learn a language is the curse words. And that's because that's the fun stuff. That's the wildly inappropriate, oh, you shouldn't say this, but I'm going to teach it to you anyway. Which is why Coco had Sora say motherfucker before actually telling her, okay, so you shouldn't say this word. So, with that in mind, I hope that you will pick your topics for the vocab class appropriately. Yeah, it wasn't the. She could have done. Was it the George Carlin words you can't say on TV? 7 words you can't say if you want to be on TV. Alrighty. I'm going to head off so that I can do my laundry. If you have other questions, I will circle back around to try and answer them, although it also seems as though there's plenty of people who are willing to share their wisdom. Yeah, you as well. Enjoy laundry. Well, I will enjoy having clean laundry. Alright. See you fine folks later.